Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The last gentle rain did not end so much as it sighed into the cracked ground of Gazorpazorp, leaving a round, darkened hollow where the planet had once remembered how to be soft. For 3 centuries, the skies had wept only acid and fury, storms that arrived like conquering armies with thunder that spoke in threats. But this final drop was different. It held the whispered echo of ancient lullabies, the soft exhale of mothers who once sang their children to sleep instead of teaching them to fight before they could walk. In that forgotten crater, the air shimmered with a patience taller than any mountain. Night came with its hard glitter, stars looking down like wary sentries, and yet beneath them something small practiced its first breaths. The collected rainwater held a mist that smelled like clean cotton and faded lullabies, and when the mist thinned, there was a newborn where no one had been a heartbeat before, wrapped not in cloth but in a hush, as if the world had decided to cradle itself for a moment. Elder Mira felt that silence tug at her long before she reached the crater. She walked evenings to outpace the noise in her head, the old cadences of command that still rattled in her chest. Her steps followed a path through the ruins of the peace gardens, where stone benches sat like patient elders, and the wind learned to speak softly, if only for a few breaths at dusk. She carried a small cloth bundle, bread, a modest sandwich wrapped in linen, a manageable comfort at the edge of a harsh day. When the quiet grew thicker than the wind, she knew to follow it, the way one follows the scent of rain long after drought has taught them not to hope. She reached the crater with a soldier's caution and a grandmother's curiosity, finding the baby's eyes open and unafraid, dark and reflective, as if each star were visiting to see. What had become of its light? The child did not cry with the harsh wails that Gazorpazorpian babies were trained to produce, those aggressive sounds that announced a new warrior's arrival. Instead, this infant made the softest humming sound like a distant melody half remembered from dreams. Mira found herself humming back, a response that felt both foreign and completely natural, as if her throat remembered songs her mind had been forced to forget. "Little one," she said finally, her voice lowering of its own accord. "Who sent you?" The question fell into the hollow and did not echo. When she lifted the child, the weight settled into her arms like a remembered duty, not heavy, just true. The air above the crater exhaled, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a distant clash of steel stuttered, paused, and faded, as if reconsidering its purpose. She wrapped the baby in her travel cloak, the same weathered fabric that had survived the destruction of 3 different homes. But now it felt transformed, suddenly precious in a way that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with something far more dangerous: hope. On the walk back to her hidden dwelling, carved into stone that still bore scrape marks of a younger, angrier planet, Mira spoke in undertones about small things: how to step where rocks remember your feet, how to keep flame alive with your body's shelter. The child listened with their whole skin, each word a blanket added to a blanket, and at her threshold, Mira realized she was not bringing the child inside. She was bringing inside a different weather. Altogether, the stone door knew Mira's touch and shifted aside, with the patience of something that had learned to keep secrets. Inside, the dwelling breathed differently than the world beyond. Here, air moved like a careful hand smoothing cloth, and shadows fell with deliberate gentleness. She had carved this sanctuary from living rock over decades, not with the brutal efficiency that Gazorpazorpian architecture demanded, but with the devotion of someone tending a wound back to wholeness. The main chamber curved inward like cupped palms, its walls bearing the subtle marks of tools used for creation rather than destruction. A small hearth held coals that seemed to burn without consuming, their light catching the edges of shelves lined with jars labeled in careful script: roots for mending, leaves for calming, dried flowers that remembered what peace felt like. Mira moved through this space with the fluid grace of someone who had made every corner a prayer for gentleness. With the baby settled against her shoulder, she prepared their first bed, not in the harsh metal cribs that Gazorpazorpian infants were assigned, but in something softer. She took down an old training shield from the wall, its surface dulled by years of deflecting blows, and lined it with her softest blankets. The transformation felt like a small miracle, metal that had learned to protect now learning to cradle. "Kes," she whispered, as she placed the child in this unlikely nest, testing the name like a prayer. Because you arrived like a breath returning. The baby's dark eyes reflected the hearth's gentle light, and something in their gaze suggested they approved of both name and cradle, settling with a soft sigh that seemed to bless the space around them. Beyond the main chamber, Mira's true rebellion flourished in hidden alcoves carved deeper into the cliff. Here grew the planet's forbidden gentleness, luminous heart-bloom orchids whose petals pulsed with steady light, whispering ferns that moved in still air as if sharing secrets, and dream moss that thrived only where silence ran deep. These were the plants that Gazorpazorp had tried to forget, the living memories of a time when the planet knew how to be tender with itself. As the night deepened, Mira found herself including Kes in the evening ritual of tending these hidden gardens. She carried the baby from plant to plant, explaining in whispers which ones liked to be sung to, and which preferred the quiet company of steady breathing. Kes watched with an attention that felt almost conversational, making soft sounds that seemed to harmonize with the gentle rustle of leaves. "These remember when our world knew how to nurture," Mira murmured, touching a cluster of silver flowers that glowed brighter at her approach. The baby responded with that same soft humming, and remarkably, the flower's light steadied, as if Kes's presence had taught them a new kind of calm. When she prepared the child's first meal, not the harsh nutrition paste that warrior infants received, but a gentle mixture made from hidden goat's milk and flower essences, Mira noticed something extraordinary. As she fed Kes, her own breathing slowed to match the baby's rhythm, and the tension she carried from decades of careful hiding began to ease from her shoulders. The feeding became a meditation, each spoonful offered and accepted with a solemnity that seemed too old for such a small being. When Kes had eaten enough, they settled back into their shield cradle with a contented sigh, and Mira realized that for the first time in years, the dwelling felt less like a hiding place and more like a home where something precious was learning how to grow. Days settled into their own quiet rhythm in Mira's carved sanctuary, each morning arriving like a gentle hand smoothing yesterday's wrinkles. Kes grew from the tiny being who hummed lullabies into a child whose very presence seemed to teach the air around them how to move more slowly, more thoughtfully. It wasn't that the world outside had changed. The distant sounds of training still echoed from the valley. Metal still rang against metal in the eternal percussion of Gazorpazorpian life. But within the stone walls of their hidden home, time itself learned to breathe differently. Mira first noticed the gift during the small storms of daily life. When she accidentally knocked over a jar of precious healing oils, her sharp intake of breath and the crash of ceramic should have sent the cave lizards scattering in their usual frantic dance. Instead, Kes looked up from where they sat among the dream moss, those dark eyes reflecting not alarm but a kind of patient curiosity. The lizards paused mid-skitter, their scales losing their panicked shimmer, and settled into stillness, as if someone had whispered an ancient word for peace. The spilled oil spread across the stone floor in a slow, deliberate pattern, rather than the chaotic splash Mira had expected. She knelt to clean it, and found her own heartbeat slowing to match the unhurried pace that seemed to emanate from Kes, like warmth from banked coals. "How do you do that, little one?" she murmured, but Kes only offered that soft humming sound that had become as familiar as breathing. As the seasons turned, Mira began to understand that Kes possessed something far more profound than magic. They carried the ability to stretch moments, to create space between impulse and action, where gentleness could take root. When the whispering ferns trembled at distant thunder, Kes's presence steadied them into graceful swaying. When Mira's own memories of violence threatened to surface during the long nights, the child's quiet breathing seemed to absorb the sharp edges of old pain, transforming them into something more bearable. The true test came during one of their careful ventures to gather supplies from the outer settlements. Mira had waited for a market day when the crowds would provide anonymity, wrapping Kes in soft cloth against her chest, where the child's unusual calm would be hidden beneath her weathered cloak. They moved through the edges of the gathering like shadows, Mira selecting what they needed with practiced efficiency. Near the grain vendor's stall, a group of young warrior trainees had gathered around 2 of their number, who were locked in the ritual dance of escalation that every Gazorpazorpian child learned before they could properly walk. Voices rose in the prescribed patterns of challenge and response, small hands moving toward practice weapons with automatic precision. The watching children formed the traditional circle, their eyes bright with anticipation of the violence that would follow. Kes stirred against Mira's chest, those dark eyes opening to focus on the scene, with the same patient curiosity they brought to everything else. What happened next unfolded so gradually that even Mira almost missed it. The shouting voices didn't stop, but they began to lose their edge, words stretching out as if the speakers had forgotten why they needed to be urgent. Hands that had been reaching for weapons slowed, then paused, then fell back to their owners' sides. The two young warriors looked at each other with growing confusion, as if trying to remember what had made them so angry just moments before. The watching circle began to disperse, children wandering away with the distracted air of people who had forgotten what they were waiting for. No peace was declared, no apologies offered. The conflict simply dissolved like mist in morning sunlight, leaving behind only a vague puzzlement and the sense that something important had been forgotten. Mira felt Kes settle back into sleep against her chest, and she understood with crystalline clarity that her adopted child possessed the most dangerous gift imaginable, on a planet built for war, the ability to remind people of their capacity for gentleness. It wasn't force or manipulation, but something infinitely more subtle. The gift of making the world pause long enough to remember that anger was a choice, not an inevitability. Walking home through the evening shadows, Mira found herself both awed and terrified by what she was protecting. In her arms rested a child who could teach storms to be gentle, who could stretch moments until fury forgot its purpose, who carried within their small form the quiet revolution that Gazorpazorp had spent centuries trying to forget. The responsibility felt sacred and impossible, like being entrusted with the last seed of peace in a world that had learned to thrive on its absence. That night, as she tucked Kes into their shield cradle beneath the soft glow of the heart-bloom orchids, Mira whispered a promise into the darkness. "I'll keep you safe until you're strong enough to keep the world safe from itself." And somewhere in the stone walls around them, the ancient peace of Gazorpazorp stirred in its long sleep, recognizing the voice of its own quiet return. Morning arrived like a promise keeping itself, and Mira woke with the quiet certainty that yesterday's whispered vow had already begun to transform into action. She moved through her dawn preparations with a different kind of purpose now, brewing tea that smelled like rain on warm stone, while Kes stirred in their shield cradle, dark eyes opening to catch the first gentle light filtering through the heart-bloom orchids. The dwelling itself seemed to sense the shift, shadows falling with more deliberate softness, as if the very walls understood they were about to become witnesses to something sacred. Behind the false stone panel near the hearth, where heat and curious hands rarely ventured, Mira retrieved the treasures she had guarded for decades. The ancient scrolls emerged wrapped in cloth that had been blessed by the last peacekeepers, their leather covers soft with age and reverence. She laid them on the low table like sleeping birds coming to rest, each one containing words that Gazorpazorp had spent centuries trying to forget. The script inside curved instead of snapped, letters that asked to be traced slowly, patiently, as if haste itself was a form of violence against meaning. "These are the words they tried to bury," Mira told Kes, who had settled beside her with an attention that seemed too profound for such small shoulders. "Their shapes teach your mouth to slow down, to make room for gentleness." She spoke the first word aloud, Veltar, the ancient term for the space between heartbeats where understanding could take root. The sound lingered in the air like incense, and the orchids brightened in response, their light steadying as if to acknowledge something true. Kes listened with their whole being, then shaped their mouth around the unfamiliar syllables. The first attempt was more breath than voice, yet somehow the whispering ferns leaned closer, their fronds trembling with recognition. They practiced together as Mira prepared their morning meal, each word becoming part of the ritual of nourishment. "Shendal," she murmured while spreading goat cheese on fresh bread, the art of making room in anger for something gentler to grow. Morthalan, as she added leaves from the dream moss, the patience that moves like roots through stone, slow but unstoppable. What amazed Mira was how Kes didn't simply learn these concepts, but seemed to embody them, each new word settling into the child's presence like water finding its level. When they practiced tenderness, The cave lizards emerged from their hiding places to bask in the warmth that suddenly filled the chamber. When Mira taught the word for deep listening, the very stones of the walls seemed to lean in, as if the dwelling itself was learning to hear with new ears. The afternoon brought stories from the scrolls, not the heroic tales of conquest that Gazorpazorpian children usually heard, but the hidden histories of the quiet warriors who had once protected their world through understanding rather than force. Mira spoke of the legendary peace weavers, whose gift for creating harmony had been so profound that their presence could transform entire communities from within. They taught conflict to become conversation, she explained, watching Kes absorb each word like the dream moss absorbed starlight, silently, completely, transforming it into something luminous. As evening approached and the orchids began their gentle dimming, Mira realized they had spent the entire day in quiet revolution. While the world outside sharpened its weapons and practiced its wars, they had been cultivating something far more dangerous, a living lexicon of forgotten peace, a child who was becoming the walking embodiment of everything Gazorpazorp had tried to destroy. In Kess's soft humming as they settled into sleep, Mira heard the echo of ancient lullabies and knew that tomorrow they would venture even deeper into the memories that waited in the hidden chambers below, where the planet's gentlest dreams lay sleeping, ready to wake. The whispered promise of deeper chambers drew them like a half-remembered lullaby, and when morning light filtered through the heart-bloom orchids with unusual warmth, Mira knew the time had come to share the secret that lived beneath all other secrets. She moved with ceremonial care, preparing provisions that would nourish both body and spirit. Bread blessed with dream moss essence, water that had been sung to by the whispering ferns, and Kess's small collection of gentle words wrapped in soft cloth like precious seeds. Behind the false stone panel where the ancient scrolls rested, another passage waited, so cunningly hidden that even the cave lizards had forgotten its existence. Mira pressed her palm against a stone that looked identical to all others, and the rock face exhaled with the patience of something that had been holding its breath for centuries. The passage that opened descended in a gentle spiral, its walls growing smoother and more deliberate with each step, as if carved by hands that had worked with love rather than haste. "The memory garden," Mira whispered, lifting Kes into her arms for the descent. "Where our planet keeps the dreams it was too afraid to throw away." The air that rose to meet them carried scents of deep earth and impossible blooming, as if somewhere far below, flowers had been dreaming themselves into existence since the last age of peace. Soft luminescence began to emanate from veins in the stone itself, the very rock remembering how to be gentle and sharing that knowledge through light. The passage opened into a vast cavern that stole breath without violence, revealing Gazorpazorp's most precious secret. Here in the planet's hidden heart, peaceful memories had taken root and flourished beyond earthly possibility. Luminescent flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, petals that shifted from silver to gold as they breathed, stems that pulsed with the rhythm of sleeping hearts, leaves that whispered lullabies in languages older than war. The compassion. Roses grew in spirals that seemed to embrace the air around them, their fragrance carrying echoes of every kind word ever spoken on Gazorpazorp. Memory lilies floated just above the moss-carpeted ground, their transparent petals holding preserved moments like photographs made of light, children laughing instead of training, lovers walking hand in hand, elders sharing wisdom instead of battle strategies. Dream blossoms clustered near a shallow pool that reflected not the cavern ceiling, but skies from gentler times. "Each bloom holds a feeling rather than a picture," Mira explained as Kes stirred in her arms, reaching toward the nearest flowers with wonder, but not urgency. They offer the essence of moments when someone chose tenderness over rage, understanding over conquest. When Kes's small fingers brushed against a memory lily, the entire bloom resonated with soft music, and suddenly the cavern filled with a lullaby that had been sung on Gazorpazorp's surface 3 centuries ago. A mother's voice, preserved in living light, still cradling her child across the centuries. As they spent the afternoon among the memory flowers, Mira witnessed something extraordinary. Kes didn't just observe the preserved moments of peace, they began contributing to them. Where the child's presence lingered, new buds appeared on ancient plants. A shared laugh became a tiny silver blossom on the iron. Compassion roses, the patient way Kes listened to the flower songs created new harmonies. in their eternal lullabies when evening approached and they prepared to return to the upper chambers. Mira realized the memory garden was no longer just a museum of Gazorpazorp's peaceful past. It had become a nursery for its gentle future. Then Kes, the planet had found not just a keeper of forgotten dreams, but a gardener who could help those dreams bloom into something alive and new. As they climbed back toward the world above, soft light from the cavern seemed to follow them, and Mira understood that the real garden was no longer hidden in the depths. It was walking among them, breathing with them, ready to teach a warrior planet how to remember wonder. The weeks that followed their descent into the memory garden moved with the deliberate pace of seasons changing, each day bringing Kes closer to the inevitable threshold that every Gazorpazorpian child must cross. Mira watched her adopted child grow taller and more thoughtful, their presence now carrying the accumulated wisdom of ancient lullabies and forgotten peace words. The sanctuary itself seemed to sense the approaching change, shadows falling with increased tenderness, as if the stone walls were trying to embrace these final quiet moments. The summons arrived carved in regulation metal, its harsh script demanding immediate compliance with the same cold authority that had once claimed Mira's own childhood. She held the tablet with steady hands, reading the familiar words that transformed her gentle gardener into citizen Kes of the outer settlements, required for mandatory warrior training. The metal felt heavier than it should, weighted with the accumulated grief of every parent who had received such a message. That evening, as they shared their meal among the heartbloom orchids, Mira spoke the truth she had been preparing for years. "They will try to teach you that gentleness is weakness," she said, watching Kes carefully tend to a small cut on their finger with the same patient attention they brought to wounded plants. "But you carry something they've forgotten exists. Your gift isn't to become like them. It's to help them remember what they've lost." Kes nodded with that deep understanding that had always seemed too profound for their years, then asked the question that had been growing between them, like light finding its way through stone. "Will the memory garden survive without us?" The concern in their voice carried the weight of someone who understood that some responsibilities transcend personal safety. "The garden has been waiting for someone like you to carry its seeds into the world above," Mira replied, pressing into Kes's hands a small pouch she had prepared with reverent care, dried petals from the compassion roses, a vial of reflecting pool water, and a tiny memory lily cutting wrapped in silk. "These will help you remember who you are when the world tries to convince you to be someone else." The morning of departure arrived with Gazorpazorp's typical grey determination, weather that demanded endurance rather than offering comfort. Kes dressed in regulation academy clothes that Mira had somehow acquired, simple grey fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Yet even in this uniform anonymity, they moved with distinctive grace that transformed walking into meditation. The academy rose from the valley floor like a monument to controlled violence, its walls scarred by generations of training. Drums marking morning drills in rhythms that always reminded Mira of tired hearts doing their duty. As they passed through the massive gates, something extraordinary occurred. The martial percussion stuttered slightly, not stopping but easing, as if the very cadence had found a place to rest between beats. In the registration hall that smelled of oiled metal and institutional efficiency, Kes joined the stream of new recruits with quiet presence that seemed to create space around them. The clerk who processed their enrollment looked up with sudden confusion, as if Kes's soft-spoken name had reminded him of something beautiful he'd forgotten. When the monitoring cuff closed around Kes's wrist, its display settled at an ideal resting rate and refused to spike, no matter how the line of nervous cadets surged around them. By evening, as bunks creaked with the restless sounds of children pretending to be warriors, Kes had already begun their quiet revolution. In the dormitory's harsh fluorescent light, they hummed the ancient, not-quite lullaby that had been their first language. One by one, breathing patterns slowed and shoulders relaxed. A homesick boy finally released the sob he'd been holding, and it dissolved into something soft enough to comfort, rather than shame. Outside the academy walls, Mira walked home under stars that seemed to shine with unusual gentleness, listening to the distant drums that now carried in their eternal rhythm the faintest echo of a different song altogether. Dawn arrived at the academy with its usual harsh efficiency, But something in the quality of morning light had shifted since Kess's arrival. The regulation whistles still pierced the air like metal birds, yet their shrillness seemed to soften slightly as they echoed through dormitories where cadets had begun sleeping more peacefully. Kess moved through the morning rituals with unhurried grace, tying boots and adjusting uniform with the same patient attention they had once given to tending Mira's hidden gardens. On the training grounds, rows of recruits practiced their forms under the watchful eyes of instructors who barked commands in rhythms designed to break will and rebuild it as weapon-ready discipline. Kess followed the movements but kept their breathing steady, their presence creating small eddies of calm in the relentless current of martial preparation. By mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows across the practice yards, the day's first revelation began to unfold. Near the spear range, a cadet with dark hair braided tight against her scalp stood at the throwing line, her posture speaking of generations bred for warfare. Zara moved with fluid precision that made other recruits pause their own training to watch, each spear leaving her hand with devastating accuracy. Yet something in her stance carried tension that went deeper than concentration, a rigidity that seemed to fight against itself, as if her body remembered movements her mind had been taught to forget. The third spear trembled in her grip before she released it, and in that moment of hesitation, Kess heard something extraordinary. Beneath the Academy's constant percussion of metal on metal, beneath the shouted commands and regulated breathing, there was another sound entirely, distant and ethereal, like temple bells ringing across landscapes that existed only in memory. When the rest period arrived and cadets scattered to find shade and sustenance, Kess approached the practice range with the small bundle Mira had taught them to carry. Simple bread with soft cheese, wrapped in cloth that still held the faint scent of heart-bloom orchids. They settled on the wooden bench, where equipment waited for afternoon sessions, and after a moment's consideration, placed half the modest sandwich beside them. Zara approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats, but when she saw the offered food, something in her expression shifted from wariness to wonder. "You shouldn't share," she said, though her voice had lost its martial edge. "Regulation portions are calculated for individual needs." "Perhaps," Kess replied gently, "but hunger shared becomes more manageable." The words carried echoes of Mira's teachings, and somehow Zara heard in them an invitation to something she had almost forgotten existed. She accepted the bread with careful hands, settling beside Kess with the first genuine relaxation she had shown since arriving at the Academy. For several breaths they ate in comfortable silence, while around them other cadets maintained the prescribed distance that Academy life demanded. "Do you hear them too?" Zara asked finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The bells that shouldn't exist here?" Kess looked at her with the same patient attention they brought to wounded plants and frightened animals. "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind has been taught to forget," they said softly. In that shared understanding, something precious began to bloom between them, a friendship that would eventually teach an entire academy that strength could include gentleness, that warriors could choose to heal as well as harm. The temple bells continued their distant ringing, calling both of them toward a future neither could yet imagine, but both were beginning to trust. The afternoon training bells called them back before the shared understanding between Kess and Zara could fully settle, their metallic voices cutting through the warm air with regulation precision. Yet something in that familiar sound had shifted, not the tone itself, but the way it seemed to pause between notes, as if the Academy's own rhythm was learning to breathe more gently. They joined the stream of cadets flowing toward the practice yards, where the serious business of combat training waited, with its ancient demands for speed, aggression, and the useful clarity that came from controlled violence. Master Ralek stood at the center of the main sparring ring, his weathered frame carrying the accumulated authority of decades spent teaching young bodies how to become weapons. His eyes moved across the assembled cadets with the practiced assessment of someone who could read potential violence in the set of shoulders, the angle of a stance, the way hands naturally fell toward imaginary weapons. When his gaze settled on Kess, something flickered across his expression. Not recognition exactly, but the puzzled attention of someone noticing an unfamiliar note in a familiar song. "Pairs," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of unquestioned tradition. Standard engagement protocols. First contact in 30 seconds. The cadets moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding them into the ritual dance of organized conflict. Kes found themselves paired with Var, a broad-shouldered recruit whose movements spoke of barely contained fury, the kind that academy training was designed to harness and direct. The sparring circle tightened as cadets positioned themselves for the familiar spectacle of controlled aggression. Var advanced with the coiled intensity that Gazorpazorpian combat demanded, his practice weapon moving in precise arcs designed to overwhelm and dominate. But when his first strike cut through the air where Kes had been standing, it found only empty space and the soft whisper of displaced air. Kes moved with the fluid grace they had learned from watching water find its way around stones, each evasion creating small pockets of stillness within Var's storm of motion. They didn't block or parry with the harsh clash of metal that usually filled these moments. Instead, they practiced Veltar, the ancient art of finding space between heartbeats where understanding could take root. When Var's weapon swept toward them, Kes was simply elsewhere, not retreating but occupying a different possibility entirely. The watching cadets grew quiet as they witnessed something unprecedented. Var's strikes, designed to find their target through speed and force, began to lose their edge as they met only air and gentle redirection. His breathing shifted from the controlled aggression of academy training to something more ragged, more desperate, as if his fury was exhausting itself against an opponent who refused to provide the resistance it needed to maintain its fire. Shendal, Kes whispered, so quietly that only Var could hear, the ancient word for the pocket of gentleness that exists within anger, waiting to be discovered. Something in Var's expression shifted, confusion replacing rage as his weapon grew heavy in hands that had forgotten why they needed to strike. When Var finally lowered his practice spear, it was not in defeat but in a kind of wondering exhaustion, as if he had just completed a long journey to a destination he hadn't known he was seeking. The silence that followed was not the usual pause between engagements, but something deeper, a moment when the entire practice yard seemed to exhale together, releasing tensions they hadn't realized they were carrying. Master Ralek stepped forward, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with the careful attention of someone witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he understood about combat. Around the ring, other sparring pairs had slowed their own movements, drawn by the strange peace that seemed to emanate from where Kes stood, still breathing in the steady rhythm that had somehow taught an entire training ground to remember what calm felt like. Master Ralek's weathered hands remained motionless at his sides as the practice yard held its transformed quiet, his experienced eyes taking in a scene that challenged every assumption he had built about combat training over decades of service. The regulation whistle hung unused around his neck, its familiar weight suddenly feeling foreign, as if the very tools of his authority had become artifacts from a different world. Around the sparring circle, cadets stood with the unconscious attention of people witnessing something that might change everything they thought they understood about strength. "Dismissed," he said finally, though his voice carried none of its usual sharp command. The word fell into the afternoon air like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of movement as cadets began to disperse with unusual thoughtfulness. Var remained seated at the circle's edge, his practice spear resting across his knees like a question he was still learning to ask. The changes that followed moved through the academy dormitories like morning, light finding its way through heavy curtains, gradual, inevitable, transforming everything it touched without announcement or fanfare. During evening rations, cadets who had never spoken began sharing quiet conversations over regulation meals that somehow tasted less institutional. In the corridors where shouting usually echoed with metallic efficiency, voices began to lower, words stretching out as if speakers had discovered that urgency was optional. Zara moved through these shifts with the fluid awareness of someone born to recognize the currents that shape kingdoms. She watched Kes navigate the subtle social geography of academy life, noting how their presence seemed to create pockets of calm in the relentless pressure of warrior training. Without conscious decision, she began steering struggling cadets toward these moments of peace. A quiet word about where restful sleep could be found, a knowing glance that suggested which corner of the common room might offer sanctuary from the day's accumulated tensions. The network that formed around Kes grew like roots finding water, organic and resilient, spreading through connections that had nothing to do with official hierarchy. There was Tam, whose nightmares of failed combat simulations dissolved when Kes hummed that ancient tune in the darkness. Nira, who discovered that the small crack in her dormitory floor had been mended with something that glowed softly in moonlight, healing not just stone, but the shame she carried from repeated training failures. Jorik, who found himself saving an injured cave moth instead of disposing of it, carrying the fragile creature to safety with hands that had been trained only for destruction. They began to recognize each other through subtle signs, a particular way of breathing during meditation periods, a tendency to step aside from conflicts rather than escalate them, the habit of humming under their breath when regulation pressure became overwhelming. These cadets shared no formal meetings or secret handshakes, yet they moved through academy life with increasing awareness of their quiet rebellion against a culture built on controlled aggression. One evening, as Zara and Kes sat in the laundry alcove that smelled of sun-warmed cloth and institutional soap, the phrase found them like a name choosing its owner. "Quiet guard," Zara whispered, testing the words as if they might dissolve if spoken too loudly. The name passed between them with the weight of recognition, not a title to wear proudly, but a promise to keep. A commitment to protecting the gentleness that Gazorpazorp had spent centuries trying to forget. Around them, the Academy's evening rhythms continued their regulated flow, yet something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between commands, in the pauses between heartbeats, where understanding could take root and grow toward whatever quiet revolution was learning to breathe in the darkness. The whispered name, Quiet Guard, settled between them in the laundry alcove like a seed finding fertile ground, carrying within it the weight of promise and the gentle urgency of something that had been waiting to be born. Zara moved with the fluid awareness of someone born to read the currents that shape kingdoms, pulling from her memory a mental map of the Academy's forgotten corners, drainage channels that sang after training drills, hairline cracks beneath barracks where official eyes never wandered, the wind-sheltered spaces near equipment storage where small things might grow unnoticed. Kes felt the weight of Mira's pouch against their chest, dried petals like folded memories, and the tiny memory lily cutting wrapped in silk that still held the scent of the underground gardens. Their revolution would not march with banners or announce itself with speeches. It would kneel beside the harsh edges of their world and offer them something infinitely more dangerous, the possibility of softness. They began after lights out, when the dormitory's breathing had merged into one patient ocean and the Academy's surveillance settled into its predictable rhythms. Tam watched the corridors with the careful attention of someone learning that vigilance could feel like caretaking rather than threat assessment. Nira brushed the monitoring cuffs with water from Mira's reflecting pool, and the devices blinked once, remembered mercy, and steadied into peaceful readings that would raise no official concern. Kes moved barefoot through the shadows, carrying their accumulated hush like a lantern that cast light only for those who needed to see. Into the loosened grout between training yard tiles, they tucked threads of dream moss that had traveled from Myra's blankets, each placement accompanied by whispered words of encouragement in the ancient tongue. At the spear range's forgotten edge, they pressed 3 compassion rose petals into soil that had been compacted by years of impacts, and Zara cupped the spot with her hands, as if warming a spark against the night's chill. The work continued in increments so small they looked like nothing to casual observation. Beneath the infirmary's water basin, Kes nestled the memory lily cutting in a chipped cup and hummed until the institutional water lost its metallic tiredness and remembered how to reflect starlight. Along the underside of the mess hall benches where arguments usually began, whisper ferns found purchase in microscopic cracks, their presence so subtle that words spoken above them simply learned to end more gently. The miracle happened 3 nights later, during one of those accidents that feel like destiny wearing work clothes. Jorik arrived at their hidden alcove carrying something precious and broken, a cave moth whose wing had been torn during a training exercise, its delicate membrane hanging in tatters that should have meant certain death. He had found himself unable to dispose of it, according to regulation, his hands remembering gentleness they had never been taught. When Tam, Nira and Zara gathered around the injured creature, something unprecedented occurred. 4 cadets sat in a rough circle, their regulation uniforms somehow looking less institutional in the soft light that seemed to emanate from wherever Kess's attention rested. As they watched in wondering silence, the cave moth's wing began to mend itself under their collective presence, torn membrane weaving back together as if their shared gentleness had reminded it how to be whole. The recognition that passed between them in that moment transformed individual rebellion into something far more powerful, a community dedicated to preserving what Gazorpazorp had spent centuries trying to destroy. Word spread through the invisible networks that exist wherever people learn to communicate in meaningful glances and careful silences. Cadets began discovering small gifts in unexpected places, dream moss tucked under pillows after brutal training days, regulation rations that somehow tasted of hope and hidden gardens, practice weapons that had been blessed with memory water and now felt less eager to cause harm. Within weeks, the academy began to change in ways too subtle for official reports, but too profound for those living within its walls to ignore. Training injuries decreased as cadets unconsciously practiced Veltar, finding spaces between aggression and harm where skill could develop without violence. Sleep came more easily in dormitories where their hidden gardens grew, gentle luminescence teaching nightmares to become ordinary dreams that could be born with grace. Master Ralek noticed, of course. His experienced eye caught the decreased medical reports, the improved cooperation during team exercises, the strange phenomenon of cadets who seemed to grow stronger through gentleness rather than controlled brutality. During his evening inspection rounds, he paused by the western barracks, where a narrow sheen of green had appeared along a crack he had stepped across 1,000 times. He touched it with one knuckle, testing its reality, and something uncoiled behind his ribs. Old weather finally leaving. Without conscious decision, he added a few extra heartbeats to the next day's water break. When the energy reports reached his desk, showing decreased restless turning during sleep hours, he studied the numbers with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read between official lines. In neat, unremarkable script, he wrote, "Variance within acceptable calibration parameters." He set the paper aside the way one lays down a weapon no longer needed. And somewhere in the gesture, the Academy's quiet revolution found its first official protector. That evening, as Kess and Zara shared a simple sandwich on the maintenance roof and watched stars practice their ancient patience above the floodlights, wind moved across the training fields, carrying the faintest measure of a lullaby over steel and stone. The gardens were not beautiful yet. They were mostly the idea of beauty, breathing softly in hidden corners where gentleness had learned to take root. But the Academy had begun to soften at its edges, and in that softening, a future was choosing where to bloom, one whispered word at a time. The lullaby that had drifted across the training fields settled into the Academy's stone foundations like a promise learning to keep itself. And in the days that followed, Kess felt something ancient stirring in the spaces between regulation and rest. The stories called to them during quiet hours, not the heroic legends that instructors used to inspire combat excellence, but subtler tales that moved like water finding its way through stone, changing everything they touched through patient persistence rather than dramatic force. It began during evening rest periods, when cadets gathered in common areas that smelled of regulation soap and accumulated exhaustion. Kess would settle near the rarely used meditation fountains, or claim a sun-warmed patch of wall near the mess hall where oversight was gentle, and let their voice move the way streams do when they decide to become rivers. They never announced a lesson, simply unwrapped half a sandwich and left the other half beside them, an invitation that said you belong here without making anyone admit they needed to. Tam arrived first more often than not, posture loose in a way that would have puzzled his former self. Nira followed with hands still carrying the scent of metal and institutional soap from laundry duty, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the floor as if coaxing shy plants to surface. Jorik lingered at careful distances, pretending to adjust equipment until the stories caught him and his shoulders forgot their perpetual guard. Zara found her place last, not from hesitation, but from the quiet habit of ensuring everyone else had somewhere to land before she did. The tales Kess shared came from Mira's ancient scrolls, stories of the Weaver warriors, whose strength lay not in conquest, but in their ability to mend torn communities with threads of understanding. They spoke of Velthara the Gentle, whose presence could transform battlefields into places where enemies remembered they had once been neighbors, and of the songkeepers whose melodies could calm the fiercest internal storms, whose words shaped disputes into dances of resolution rather than clashes of will. These weren't stories of weakness, masquerading as strength. They were tales of warriors who understood that true protection sometimes required the courage to choose gentleness over violence, that the greatest battles were often won by understanding an opponent's heart rather than defeating their body. Each narrative carried within it seeds of practical wisdom, techniques that could be woven into modern training without abandoning the strength that Gazorpazorp still needed. The transformation spread through the Academy's informal networks with the quiet persistence of morning, light finding its way through heavy curtains. Arguments in the mess hall began to dissolve into puzzled silences, as if participants had suddenly remembered more harmonious ways to communicate. Training partners started marking pauses into their drills, brief glimpses of Veltar where correction could arrive without shame. Sleep grew kinder as dreams stopped shouting and began to murmur workable possibilities. Master Ralek passed by during his evening rounds, leaning against doorframes as if his bones had found walls they trusted. He pretended to study inspection slates, while stories moved past him like weather, and when tales ended, he would clear his throat with unnecessary volume and announce hydration protocols in a voice that had misplaced its bark. No one spoke of his visits, and he did not forbid them. "You're teaching them to be warrior poets," Zara observed one evening as they watched Dream Moss pulse with soft luminescence in their hidden alcove. Not instead of being fighters, but in addition to it. The stories became a shared language among the growing network of the Quiet Guard, living lessons that provided framework for their gentle revolution. When a cadet showed unusual patience during drills or offered kindness to struggling peers, it was understood as an echo of the ancient ways, a quiet act of courage that reinforced their shared purpose of weaving Gazorpazorp's peaceful past into its warrior future, creating something entirely new from the marriage of ancient wisdom and modern necessity. The stories had woven themselves into the Academy's evening rhythms like threads of starlight through Regulation Grey, and as the tales settled into memory, something deeper began to stir among the Quiet Guard. The week had been particularly demanding, extended combat simulations that pushed bodies past comfortable limits, sleep compressed to teach endurance through exhaustion alone. By evening, the dormitories hummed with brittle energy, conversations that snapped instead of flowed, tools handled with unnecessary force. Kess felt the collective tension gathering like storm clouds, that electric quality when too many people carry more than they can comfortably hold. The careful peace they had cultivated through months of patient work felt fragile, beautiful, but vulnerable to the wrong pressure. In the mess hall where their stories usually bloomed, cadets moved with shortened tempers and voices that had forgotten how to soften. "Maybe," Zara said quietly as they sat in their hidden alcove, watching Dream Moss pulse with gentle luminescence, "we should let the words rest and see what grows in their absence." The suggestion passed through their network like wind through tall grass, bending everything in the same direction without breaking a single blade. They chose the old assembly hall behind the auxiliary yards, where burned-out floodlights had created a pocket of merciful darkness. Nira touched the door handles with reflecting pool water until the metal remembered kindness and no longer squeaked. Tam studied patrol patterns and found those precious minutes when surveillance looked without truly seeing. The word spread through careful glances and hummed cadences that meant meet where night forgets to glare. They came without noise, one by one, uniforms muted under the gentle weight of intention. No formal circle, no ceremony, just bodies finding ground in the simplest arrangement of trust. Kess settled near the center and did nothing to lead. Leadership, they had learned, was sometimes best expressed as willingness to become indistinguishable from everyone else. At first, the room held leftover momentum from the day, breath still clipped at regulation speed, shoulders echoing commands long after speakers had gone to bed. The silence wore its awkwardness like a new uniform, too stiff at the seams, but time, given even the smallest invitation, knows how to soften edges. Slowly, breathing lengthened. Backs found more honest shapes. In the growing quiet, A cadet who had never allowed himself to be seen without armor began to cry without spectacle, tears landing like rain on a roof that had been waiting for weather. No one reached to comfort him, and somehow that was the greatest comfort of all. The room learned the shape of his grief without trying to rearrange it, and the silence deepened into Veltar, the true space between beats where understanding puts down roots. Minutes moved past without announcing themselves. Monitoring cuffs, tuned to catch spikes of agitation, slipped into an ease so steady it might have been mistaken for sleep. A dozen restless minds found for the first time in years the feeling of being held by something larger than instruction. Footsteps approached down the corridor and paused. The door did not open. On the other side, Master Ralik let his hand rest against the wood, palm absorbing warmth from a room choosing to remember itself. He lowered his hand and walked on, his inspection slate tucked under his arm like a book closed after the best chapter. When they finally stood, no cue ended the gathering. The silence itself chose an exit that harmed nothing. They drifted back to bunks with faces that looked inexplicably rested, like people returning from a shoreline only they could see. In the days that followed, drills felt less like strain and more like craftsmanship. Arguments learned to tire of themselves sooner, and something precious had been protected in the pretense that the night had never occurred. The night of shared silence had left something precious in its wake, a quality of attention that moved through the academy's corridors like morning light learning new ways to fall. Cadets who had never questioned the rigid architecture of their training began approaching Kess with questions that carried the weight of genuine seeking, not rebellion exactly, but a growing awareness that strength might have more faces than regulation had taught them to recognize. In the days following their gathering, the hunger for deeper understanding spread through the quiet guard like roots finding water. During combat drills, partners began creating small pauses between movements, brief glimpses of Veltar where correction could arrive without shame. The mess hall conversations grew longer, voices discovering they could carry meaning without urgency. Even the monitoring cuffs seemed to settle into gentler rhythms, as if the devices themselves had learned to breathe more peacefully. Far from the academy's softening corridors, Mira woke with the feeling that a hush had crossed the planet like a cloud passing over the moon. The heart-bloom orchids near her bed held their light steady instead of pulsing, as if listening for something delicate and distant. She followed the familiar descent into the memory garden, where the reflecting pool showed not the cave ceiling, but glimpses of still bodies breathing together in trust rather than fear. New blossoms had appeared since her last visit, small and unassuming, clustered near the moss border between stone and water. When she bent close, they released a scent that reminded her of shared bread and patient hands, ordinary comforts arranged with reverence. The flowers hummed in many voices at once, a chorus stitched from steady breaths, and Mira understood that the night of shared quiet had rooted here as living memory. Back in the upper chamber, she prepared a message with the same care she once reserved for dressing wounds. On thin slate, she wrote slowly, letting her hand learn the shape of each idea. You cannot argue with storms, but you can invite them to rain in ways that feed the ground. Before each drill, ask your partner 3 quiet questions. What hurts? What do you need? Where does it soften? Breathe until you hear answers that do not arrive in words. She added patterns for new practices discovered in the garden's listening, movements so slow they felt like dreaming someone else's steps, strikes that pointed toward places that could become kinder. The slate went to the weekly laundry runner with careful instructions for the one who hums, and Mira trusted the Academy's invisible networks to carry care into uncertain hands. That evening, Kess and Zara sat in their hidden alcove, watching dream moss pulse with gentle luminescence. The changes around them felt both profound and fragile, beautiful but vulnerable to the wrong pressure. They spoke in whispers about the questions cadets had begun asking, the way training partners looked at each other with new curiosity, the strange phenomenon of arguments that seemed to tire of themselves sooner. We're being noticed, Zara said quietly, her warrior's instincts reading currents that others might miss. Not as threat, not yet. But the patterns are too consistent to ignore much longer. Kess felt the weight of expanding responsibility settle across their shoulders like a cloak they were still learning to wear. The memory garden's influence pulsed gently in their chest, reminding them that what had begun as individual healing was becoming collective transformation. Such changes eventually drew attention from those whose power depended on keeping things exactly as they had always been. Around them, the Academy's evening rhythms continued their regulated flow, yet something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between commands, in the pauses between heartbeats, where understanding could take root. The time for hiding was ending, and the time for standing openly in the light of what they had created was about to begin. The slate arrived like a whisper of home, its smooth surface carrying Mira's careful script across the distance between hidden sanctuary and regulated halls. Kes traced the familiar words with reverent fingers, feeling the weight of accumulated wisdom settling into their chest like seeds finding fertile ground. What hurts? What do you need? Where does it soften? The questions moved through their awareness with the patient persistence of water wearing new channels through stone. That morning, the training grounds hummed with their usual metallic efficiency, yet something in the quality of attention had shifted since the night of shared silence. Cadets moved through formations with the same precision, but their eyes held new curiosity, as if they were beginning to see their partners as more than practice opponents. When Kes approached Rix, a sharp-edged cadet whose movements spoke of old pain carefully hidden, the moment felt ripe for gentle revolution. "Before we begin," Kes said softly, their voice barely audible above the distant percussion of training, "may I ask what hurts today?" Rix's practiced combat stance faltered, his eyes widening with the startled recognition of someone hearing an unexpected kindness. After a long breath, he touched his shoulder with unconscious honesty. "Old injury, always tight before drills." The second question arrived like morning light, finding its way through heavy curtains. "What do you need?" Rick shifted uncomfortably, unused to such intimate inquiry in a place built for controlled aggression. "Time to warm it properly," he admitted, "but there's never enough." "Where does it soften?" Kes finished, their presence creating space where vulnerability could exist without shame. Rix closed his eyes, and for a moment his shoulders dropped, releasing tension he usually wore like armor. "When I move slowly," he whispered, "when I don't have to prove anything." What followed transformed regulation drill into something approaching dance. Kes guided their movements to honor Rix's limitation, creating sequences where skill could develop without exacerbating old wounds. Their sparring became conversation between bodies learning to trust, precision emerging from patience rather than force. Around them, other pairs began to pause mid-drill, drawn by the strange peace that seemed to emanate from where understanding had taken root. Master Ralek moved through the training grounds with the measured attention of someone witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions. He paused by their circle, watching 3 exchanges, then 4. The harsh efficiency he had spent decades cultivating was transforming into something more nuanced, strength that included gentleness, discipline that made room for healing. By midday, the changes rippled through the Academy's careful systems. Injury reports showed unprecedented decreases. Monitoring cuffs registered heart rates that recovered faster, stress responses that smoothed sooner. In the mess hall, conversations grew longer and softer, as if voices had remembered they could carry meaning without urgency. The 3 questions spread through the quiet guards' invisible networks, like morning light, finding every corner. Training partners began each session with brief inquiries that honored both strength and vulnerability. The infirmary, usually bustling with regulation injuries, sat unusually quiet, while Nira reorganized supplies that suddenly weren't needed. That evening, as reports climbed through official channels carrying statistics that spoke of efficiency gains and improved cooperation, somewhere in distant offices attention began to gather. Not alarm yet, but focus shifting toward an academy where warriors were learning to heal as they trained, where ancient wisdom was weaving itself into modern necessity with quiet persistence. In their hidden alcove, Kes and Zara watched Dream Moss pulse with gentle luminescence, both understanding that their patient revolution had crossed an invisible threshold. The time for hiding was ending, and whatever came next would test whether Gazorpazorp was ready to remember that true strength had always included the courage to be gentle. The reports that climbed through official channels carried numbers that spoke louder than whispers, statistics that transformed months of patient revolution into data points demanding explanation. Injury rates down by unprecedented margins, cooperation indices rising beyond projected parameters, sleep quality measurements that made seasoned analysts pause and read twice. In distant offices where decisions shaped worlds, attention gathered like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Zara felt the shift before anyone announced it, her royal bloodline carrying instincts honed by generations who had learned to read power's approach in the quality of silence that preceded its arrival. The way administrative staff moved with heightened precision, the frequency of inspection visits that lingered just moments longer than regulation required, the particular tension that settled over Master Rallick's shoulders when he reviewed evening reports, all spoke of evaluation from above. The summons came during evening meditation, delivered by a cadet whose regulation posture couldn't quite hide her nervousness. "Cadet Zara, Master Rallick requests your immediate presence." The words fell into their circle of shared quiet like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of awareness that spread through the quiet guard's invisible networks. Master Rallick's office held the accumulated weight of decades spent shaping young warriors, yet something in the space felt different now. Softened at the edges by months of witnessing transformation, he was still learning to understand. When Zara entered, she found him standing by the window that overlooked training grounds, where cadets moved with unusual grace, their forms carrying echoes of ancient temple dances disguised as combat drills. "Your lineage has been confirmed," he said without preamble, turning to face her with eyes that carried both respect and concern. "Royal bloodline, direct descent from the last peaceful rulers. The War Council has taken notice of our improvements, and they want to understand whether leadership is emerging naturally or being cultivated deliberately." Zara felt the weight of heritage settle across her shoulders like a cloak she had always known she would eventually wear. The temple bells that had been whispering in her dreams grew clearer, more insistent, calling her toward a future that felt both inevitable and necessary. "What have you told them?" she asked, her voice carrying the steady authority that royal blood recognized in its own. "That leadership cannot be manufactured, only recognized when it emerges," Master Rallick replied, touching a stack of reports with careful attention. "That the improvements suggest natural development rather than external manipulation. That sometimes the strongest warriors are those who understand when not to fight." In the conversation that followed, Zara found herself articulating truths she had absorbed from Kess like light drawn into deep water. She spoke not of sentiment, but of efficiency, weaving principles of empathy into the pragmatic language of military effectiveness. "When cadets understand the why behind their training, their commitment deepens," she explained. "When they feel heard, their focus sharpens. We are still producing formidable warriors, they're simply becoming more complete." "They will come to evaluate," Master Rallick said finally, his voice carrying warning and preparation in equal measure. "If what has grown here is to survive, it must demonstrate that it serves Gazorpazorp's protection rather than threatening its foundations." As Zara walked back through corridors that hummed with evening quiet, she felt the full weight of what lay ahead. The gentle revolution they had nurtured in hidden alcoves was about to face its greatest test, and she would stand as its voice before those who still believed that strength and tenderness could never share the same heart. The knowledge of impending evaluation settled over the quiet guard like morning mist, carrying both warning and invitation. And in the days that followed Zara's conversation with Master Rallick, something deeper than strategy began to emerge from their careful planning. The cadets who had learned to breathe together in shared silence now faced the prospect of standing openly in light that might either bless or burn what they had. Cultivated in hidden alcoves and whispered gatherings, Kess felt the memory garden's influence pulsing gently in their chest as they sat with Zara in their familiar alcove. Dream moss casting its patient luminescence over faces that carried new gravity. "We need to show them what we've become, not just tell them," Zara said, her royal instincts reading currents that would soon carry all their fates. "The War Council understands demonstration better than explanation. They need to witness warriors who are more effective, because they've learned to be whole." The plan that crystallized honored both transparency and protection, wrapping their gentle revolution in the careful language of institutional acceptability. They would organize what appeared to be historical research, a festival celebrating Gazorpazorp's complete warrior heritage, including elements of the planet's peaceful past that had been systematically forgotten. The songs preserved in Mira's memory garden would emerge as recently discovered cultural artifacts. The base 3 questions would become enhanced training, protocols based on ancient military efficiency, techniques, historical cadence restoration, Zara murmured, testing the phrase like a key that might unlock official doors. Presented as research into morale stabilization activities, the words felt solid enough to carry their precious cargo of transformation without betraying its true nature. Word spread through the quiet. Guards invisible networks with the particular grace that quiet things possess when they're desperately needed. Tam approached the Academy's cultural archives with scholarly enthusiasm, discovering that official records contained convenient gaps where peaceful traditions had once lived, spaces perfect for their careful reconstruction. Nira coordinated with kitchen staff and supply requisitions, transforming regulation resources into something approaching ceremony. Jorik moved through the task of preparing spaces with the same patient attention he brought to tending wounded creatures, weaving subtle beauty into institutional grey. The Festival of Forgotten Songs took shape like dawn arriving without announcement, each element emerging so naturally from the Academy's existing rhythms that it felt less like innovation and more like remembering something that had always been waiting to return. In dusty archives, Nira compiled fragments of ancient lullabies and work songs that had somehow survived official forgetting. Tam revealed unexpected talent for crafting instruments from discarded training materials, drums that spoke with deeper voices than war percussion, flutes carved from practiced spear shafts that sang of wind through peaceful valleys. Master Ralek moved through their preparations with measured attention, approving requisitions with unusual speed and scheduling modifications with careful consideration. When questioned about the festival's educational value, he spoke eloquently about the importance of understanding warrior heritage in its complete historical context, his words carrying the weight of someone who had learned to navigate between official necessity and deeper truth. As evening approached on the day before evaluation, the rarely used assembly hall had transformed into something that honored both strength and gentleness. Soft hangings woven from regulation materials caught light in ways that made harsh angles gentle. Dream moss from their hidden gardens provided luminescence that taught shadows to fall with deliberate kindness. The space breathed differently, institutional air learning to carry the possibility of wonder. Kess stood at the hall's center, not to lead but to anchor, their presence creating the same pocket of calm that had first appeared in training circles months ago. Around them, the quiet guard moved with quiet purpose, each understanding their role in demonstrating that warriors could be more than weapons. That strength could include the courage to remember what their planet had tried so hard to forget. The first cadets entered with regulation posture that slowly softened under the unfamiliar atmosphere, as voices began to rise in melodies that celebrated building rather than breaking, creating rather than conquering. The Academy's evening rhythms shifted into something unprecedented. The sound of Gazorpazorp learning to sing its own gentle heart back into existence, one carefully chosen note at a time. Outside the transformed hall, stars gathered to witness what would unfold when morning brought judgment from those who still believed that power and the tenderness could never share the same warrior's heart. The first notes rose like morning mist finding its voice, and the Festival of Forgotten Songs opened its arms to whoever needed shelter from the world's sharp edges. In the transformed assembly hall, cadets who had known only the metallic percussion of combat commands discovered their own voices, joining ancient melodies, tentative at first, then stronger, as if their very bones remembered songs their minds had been taught to forget. Kess stood near the hall's heart, not performing but anchoring, their presence creating the same pocket of calm that had first appeared in training circles months ago. Around them, the quiet guard moved through songs that celebrated building rather than breaking. Lullabies that spoke of mothers cradling children under wise stars, work songs that honored the rhythm of creation, ballads that transformed conflict into conversation. The dream moss woven through regulation hangings pulsed with gentle luminescence, teaching institutional shadows how to fall with deliberate kindness. The transformation rippled outward like water finding new channels. Staff who had come to monitor lingered at doorways, forgetting their clipboards as voices carried them toward memories they hadn't known they were keeping. A mess sergeant stepped inside with sleeves rolled, wiped his hands on regulation toweling, and stayed through 3 songs, humming without knowing when he started. The security technician posted in the corridor let cameras drift wider, capturing not faces to catalogue but a room learning how to breathe together. By dawn, the festival's influence had travelled on uniforms and breath, tucked into pockets as folded melodies, and carried through corridors in boots dusted with dream moss spores. Letters written that night contained phrases no academy manual had taught. I asked what hurt, and he told me honestly. A courier on the midnight run to outer settlements found herself humming without thinking, and at the first rest stop, a child in a doorway hummed back, as if the song had been waiting in both of them for years. In the valley market, 2 merchants reached for the same supply crate and braced for familiar quarrel, then paused as one asked, "What do you need?" The other blinked as if woken gently. "Honestly, my back hurts." They lifted together and somehow the crate felt lighter than regulation weight. A patrol unit scheduled for dawn drills adjusted pace without command, matching the breath of a recruit who had slept poorly, yet arrived early anyway, as if the road itself had smoothed to honor their care. The War Council's transport settled onto the Academy landing platform with mechanical precision that made morning air vibrate with authority, 3 figures emerging in ceremonial armor that spoke of decisions made where gentleness was considered luxury Gazorpazorp could not afford. Commander Vex moved with fluid menace that read weakness in heartbeat intervals, while strategist Kral carried himself like a weapon that had never questioned its purpose. Between them walked Councillor Thane, whose eyes held the particular weariness of someone who had watched idealism dissolve under necessary pragmatism for decades. Master Ralek met them with measured respect that protocol demanded, his posture carrying just enough deference to avoid challenge while maintaining dignity, earned through successful service. The morning inspection followed familiar rhythms, dormitories examined for compliance, equipment assessed for maintenance, cadets observed with clinical attention of those evaluating potential threats to established order. Yet something in the Academy's atmosphere puzzled the evaluators, a quality of attention that didn't match expectations of institutional military efficiency. Cadets moved through routines with unusual grace, voices carrying undertones that spoke of shared understanding rather than mere compliance. When Commander Vex paused to observe combat drills, she witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about warrior training. The sparring circles held their usual metallic percussion, yet sounds seemed somehow more musical, as if practice weapons had learned to harmonize rather than simply compete. Partners moved with fluid awareness that honored both skill and safety, exchanges demonstrating precision without the brittle edge of controlled aggression. When one cadet stumbled during complex maneuvers, his opponent offered steadying support so naturally it looked choreographed rather than instinctive. Enhanced training protocols, Master Ralek explained when strategist Kral's eyebrows rose in question. We've discovered that understanding enhances rather than undermines combat efficiency. When cadets train with awareness of partners' capabilities, they develop more nuanced skills. The true revelation came during afternoon demonstrations, when Zara stepped forward with fluid authority that royal bloodline recognized in its own. Her partner was Kess, whose presence seemed to create space where skill could unfold without violence. What followed challenged every assumption about strength and gentleness being mutually exclusive, an exchange that moved like conversation between bodies that had learned complete trust, precision emerging from patience rather than aggression. When Zara's strikes found their marks, they did so with surgical accuracy that neutralized without destroying, effectiveness that honored both warrior necessity and human dignity. The watching cadets responded with appreciation that sounded like music rather than mere approval, voices rising in harmonies that celebrated mastery rather than domination. Commander Vex found herself leaning forward, despite professional restraint, drawn by the strange beauty of combat that had remembered how to be art. In the silence that followed their demonstration, something shifted in the quality of attention, recognition that they were witnessing not rebellion against Gazorpazorp's warrior culture, but its evolution into something more complete. This requires further evaluation, Councillor Thane said finally, his voice carrying weight beyond words. The Academy's gentle revolution had found its voice, speaking in harmonies that honored both strength and mercy. And now that voice would face its greatest test in chambers where the planet's future was decided. One careful breath at a time, the silence that followed Counselor Thane's words settled over the Academy like evening mist carrying both promise and uncertainty. And in the hours that stretched between sunset and dawn, the War Council's private deliberation chambers held conversations that would reshape not just the Academy, but Gazorpazorp's understanding of what it meant to be strong. Commander Vex paced with measured precision, while strategist Kral studied data tablets displaying statistics impossible to ignore, injury rates that defied expectation, cooperation indices that challenged fundamental assumptions, efficiency measurements that suggested something unprecedented was emerging from regulation halls. "The numbers don't lie," Councillor Thane said finally, his weathered voice carrying authority earned through decades of necessary decisions. Combat effectiveness up 30%, medical incidents down by half, psychological stability ratings beyond anything we've recorded. Whatever methods they're employing, they're producing superior results. Commander Vex paused her pacing, armor catching harsh chamber light. Statistics can be manipulated. What concerns me is the hesitation I witnessed, the concern for opponents' well-being during combat. Such tendencies could prove fatal in actual conflict. Yet something in her voice suggested curiosity, rather than condemnation, as if the Academy's influence had traveled on uniforms and breath, creating space where even hardened strategists could consider dangerous possibilities. Back at the Academy, word of extended deliberation spread through the quiet guards' invisible networks, like morning light finding every corner. The waiting felt different from previous tensions, not brittle anxiety of those expecting punishment, but patient attention of people who had done necessary work and now trusted the universe to recognize its value. Kes and Zara spent quiet hours in their hidden alcove, watching Dream Moss pulse with gentle luminescence while they prepared for whatever formal evaluation would follow. The summons arrived with dawn, carried by Master Rallick, whose steady presence had become their anchor in institutional storms. "They want demonstration," he said simply, his eyes holding both pride and concern. "Not performance, proof. They need to witness effectiveness, not elegance." The War Council chamber held centuries of accumulated authority, its metal walls scarred by heated debates and cooled by necessary compromises. When Kes and Zara entered with Master Rallick, the space seemed to exhale, harsh angles softening slightly under their combined presence. Commander Vex, Strategist Kral, and Councillor Thane sat with the formal attention of those prepared to witness something that might change everything they thought they understood about strength. "Before we begin," Kes said softly, stepping forward with unhurried grace, "may we demonstrate the practical application of our methods?" They produced 2 monitoring cuffs, standard Academy equipment designed to measure stress responses during training. A brief comparison, regulation protocol, then enhanced approach. Commander Vex accepted a cuff without hesitation, her warrior's instincts reading the challenge as invitation rather than threat. What followed was a standard engagement at regulation pace, their movements precise and efficient. The monitoring displays spiked as expected, sharp stress responses, controlled aggression, hearts racing with familiar combat rhythms. Then Kes lifted a hand, not to parry, but to create space between heartbeats. "What hurts?" The question arrived without ornament, and Vex's grip shifted almost imperceptibly on the practice blade, veteran's ache acknowledging itself. "What do you need?" The weapon adjusted to a more sustainable angle. "Where does it soften?" Their exchange resumed, fractionally slower but immeasurably clearer. The monitoring displays told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions. Stress levels dropped while precision held steady, recovery time shortening by heartbeats that mattered on real battlefields. Kral watched the numbers, then the bodies, then the numbers again, as if his instruments were learning a new language. "Interesting," he murmured, which from him sounded like distant bells ringing recognition. Vex didn't praise, she tested. A sudden feint designed to punish softness met not rigid resistance but Veltar, the space Kes had carried from Mira's garden to this bright, hard chamber. Gentle redirection, palm placed where force became harmless. The movement ended with both standing uninjured, alert, effective. Vex's eyebrows lifted by degrees only soldiers would notice. Zara spoke then in the pragmatic music of leadership, her royal heritage lending weight to words carefully chosen. She did not mention temple bells or memory lilies, but spoke of retention boosted because cadets felt seen, unit cohesion that endured strain, response times improved because panic had learned to find breath before choosing targets. "We are not unmaking warriors," she said, voice steady as held notes. "We are completing them." Master Ralek laid out quiet evidence: fewer days lost to injury, fewer infractions born of frayed tempers, drills completed with higher fidelity. He did not hide risks. Culture does not turn like wheels greased with hope alone. He simply placed reality on the table and let it be seen. The deliberation that followed moved through familiar territories of military philosophy, yet something in the discussion's quality had shifted. Strategist Kral spoke of adaptive advantages, warriors who understood opponents' motivations and could anticipate actions more effectively. Commander Vex acknowledged that soldiers maintaining psychological stability under pressure might make superior tactical decisions. Councillor Thane listened the way tired water listens to stones, absorbing weight until understanding settled. "When I was young," he said almost to himself, "my grandmother sang working songs that made heavy things lighter." The chamber held its breath. "I am prepared to authorize trial expansion. This academy will formalize these protocols. 2 districts will adopt them under observation. If strength wanes, we stop. If strength deepens, we continue." Vex inclined her head, concession that felt less like surrender than respect. "Prove it under pressure," she said. "Prove it when conditions are unfriendly." "We will," Zara answered. And the temple bells she sometimes heard in dreams sounded closer. Not loud, just certain. Outside, the day moved with usual discipline, yet corridors carried new quiet that felt less like hush than promise. In Mira's underground garden, pale blooms opened near the reflecting pool without being touched, their scent like bread shared between careful friends. Kes felt it from far away the way one feels weather changing, exhaling not triumphant, but ready for work that follows. Yes, the Academy's gentle revolution had found its voice, speaking in harmonies that honored both strength and mercy, and now that voice would carry across districts where warriors were learning that true power included the courage to remember what their world had tried so hard to forget. Authorization arrived like morning mist finding its voice, settling into the Academy's stone foundations through careful signatures beneath columns of numbers that spoke louder than proclamations. Master Ralek convened quiet sessions where Kes, Zara, and seasoned instructors translated whispered wisdom into language that could pass through official doors without losing its heart. The 3 questions became pre-engagement wellness protocols, while Veltar emerged as adaptive response. Intervals on phrases dull enough to survive any committee yet precious enough to carry. Transformation. 2 districts accepted the trial expansion, like thirsty ground welcoming patient rain. Ironhold Garrison, scarred by generations of harsh training, received instructors who carried lullabies tucked behind regulation metrics. Coastal Station, where territorial disputes had festered for decades, opened its doors to warriors trained in the art of understanding opponents before engaging them. Each location presented unique challenges that would test whether gentleness could survive contact with necessity. Commander Thers arrived from the Northern Territories, with skepticism earned through conflicts where hesitation meant death. Her weathered hands spoke of battles won through decisive force, and she watched Kes guide training circles with the wary attention of someone expecting dangerous naivety. When she demanded demonstration under hostile conditions, stepping into the practice ring with veterans' menace, the Academy's quiet revolution faced its most crucial test. What followed challenged every assumption about strength and gentleness being mutually exclusive. Thers moved with practiced deception, seeking to exploit any weakness that sentiment might create. Kes met her challenge not with matching aggression, but with surgical precision that read true intention in the set of shoulders, responding to what was rather than what appeared to be. The exchange ended with both warriors standing uninjured, alert, effective, Thes's weapon neutralized through understanding rather than force. The silence that followed held weight beyond words. Thes examined her practice blade as if seeing it for the first time, then looked at Kes with recognition, that sounded like distant bells ringing acknowledgement. "Interesting," she said, which from her carried the weight of mountains shifting toward acceptance. Reports climbed through official channels, carrying statistics that transformed months of patient work into undeniable evidence. Injury rates plummeting across trial districts, cooperation indices rising beyond projected parameters, territorial disputes resolving through negotiation rather than bloodshed. Yet the most profound changes moved through territories that numbers couldn't capture. The quality of attention in training halls, conversations that grew longer and softer, voices discovering they could carry meaning without urgency. In Mira's memory garden, new blossoms appeared without being planted, their luminescence pulsing with rhythms that matched heartbeats across distant districts. The reflecting pool showed glimpses of warriors practicing ancient questions in regulation halls, their voices carrying echoes of lullabies that had survived official forgetting. Coherence ivy climbed the stone walls, its leaves shaped like joined hands, vibrating with the hum of bridges and forges where gentleness was learning to coexist with strength. Word traveled faster than orders, down mess lines and along maintenance corridors, across markets that had learned to ask better questions. The quiet guard's work had slipped into daylight without spectacle, and somewhere in administrative chambers, agenda items appeared for the coming cycle, formal recognition for integrated training excellence, lines on slates that could become doors, and doors that might open pathways wide enough for an entire planet to walk through together, one careful breath at a time. The agenda items that had appeared in administrative chambers bloomed into formal recognition with the patient persistence of morning light finding every corner. And as the planetary cycle turned toward ceremonial conclusion, something unprecedented began to take shape in halls where Gazorpazorp's future was decided. The transformation arrived not with fanfare or proclamations, but through the quiet authority of policy rewritten, directives issued in language careful, enough to soothe traditionalists while opening doors for those who had learned to walk a different path. The Academy's main assembly, Hull bore witness to its own metamorphosis, harsh fluorescent fixtures replaced with luminescence that pulsed gently, teaching institutional shadows how to fall with deliberate kindness. Where regulation banners once proclaimed martial efficiency, new hangings wove together symbols of Gazorpazorp's complete heritage, crossed spears beside blooming vines, armor that protected flowers as well as flesh. The space breathed differently now, stone walls learning to exhale decades of accumulated tension. Master Ralek stood among assembled instructors, his weathered frame carrying new ease that spoke of burdens finally shared. The official charter he presented outlined something unprecedented: establishment of the Gazorpazorpian Peace Corps, their planetary division dedicated to preservation and integration of holistic warrior development. The language was deliberately administrative, yet beneath its surface lay the profound truth of a world remembering its own heart. When Zara stepped forward to accept leadership of this new institution, the assembly hall's hard angles seemed to soften further, as if dream moss had found ways to grow along stone seams. She spoke not of conquest but of completion, her voice carrying the weight of temple bells finally ringing in full daylight. "We have not abandoned our warrior heritage," she said, addressing representatives from districts where gentle revolution had taken root. "We have fulfilled it. Strength without wisdom becomes destruction. Our ancestors knew this before we forgot how to listen." The moment arrived with understated ceremony when Kess was named the Corps' first peacekeeper, a title that spoke not of rank, but of guardianship. They accepted with the same unhurried grace they brought to tending wounded plants, understanding that their work involved cultivating understanding rather than commanding armies. The insignia they received was modest, a slim pause mark resting between two stars, stitched in thread that looked unremarkable until moonlight found it, symbol of the space between heartbeats where gentleness could take root. What followed challenged every assumption about military ceremony. The assembled representatives chose shared silence, hundreds of warriors breathing together without command, monitoring devices, registering heart rates that synchronized naturally, the strange phenomenon of collective stillness that held not emptiness but fullness. In that quiet, the Academy's gentle revolution became the planet's gentle evolution, transformation spreading like patient rain across districts, where children would learn both combat techniques and lullabies. Reports began filtering back from distant, settlements, decreased conflicts in border regions, communities resolving disputes through conversation rather than escalation, an inexplicable calm settling over areas where Peace Corps methods had taken root. Small gardens appeared in unexpected places, dream moss finding corners of mess halls, compassion roses blooming near guard posts like quiet reminders of forgotten tenderness. Far beneath the academy, Mira felt the shift like gentle breeze across her face. The heart-bloom orchids pulsed with unusual vibrancy, and the reflecting pool showed wider vistas, a world beginning to soften to remember. New blossoms opened near the water's edge without being touched, their scent like bread shared between careful friends, and she understood that the child she had found in a crater had stepped into daylight, carrying exactly what their world had forgotten it needed. The revolution was no longer theirs alone to carry. It belonged now to everyone who had learned that true warriors protect with understanding as well as weapons, with patient persistence as well as force, knowing that the gentlest changes are often the most lasting. The seasons turned with unusual gentleness that year, as if Gazorpazorp's weather itself had learned to breathe more peacefully. And in the quiet spaces between official recognition and daily practice, Mira felt time settling around her like evening light finding its final resting place. The heartbloom orchids near her bed no longer pulsed with urgent messages, but held their luminescence steady, glowing with the deep contentment of promises, kept and seeds planted in soil, that had finally remembered how to nurture what it received. Her morning walks through the memory garden revealed transformations that spoke of cycles completing themselves with natural grace. The reflecting pool showed glimpses of children across Gazorpazorp, learning both combat forms and lullabies, their voices carrying melodies that had traveled from hidden chambers to regulation halls without losing their essential sweetness. New compassion roses had appeared wherever understanding had taken root in the world above, their spirals expanding like gentle ripples across water. The message arrived with evening's familiar hush, carried by a young Peace Corps member whose uniform bore the modest insignia of pause between stars. Kess was returning for what they called a gathering of gratitudes, though Mira understood from the careful phrasing that this visit carried the weight of farewell wrapped in celebration. She prepared with the same reverence she had once reserved for tending the planet's most fragile secrets, knowing that some endings arrive like gifts that have been perfectly timed. When Kess appeared at her threshold, they moved with quiet authority that spoke of someone who had learned to hold both strength and gentleness without contradiction. The child who had once hummed ancient lullabies in a shield cradle had become the adult who taught warriors to find space between heartbeats. Yet something essential remained unchanged. The same patient attention that had once coaxed shy plants to surface now applied to coaxing entire communities toward understanding. They spent the afternoon in the upper chamber where it had all begun, sharing bread blessed with dream moss essence, while stories moved between them like familiar weather. Kess spoke of districts where the three questions had become natural as breathing, of training halls where Veltar was practiced not as technique, but as recognition of shared humanity. Mira listened with the deep satisfaction of someone watching seeds become forests, her weathered hands tracing patterns on the table where ancient scrolls had first revealed their secrets. As evening approached, they descended together into the memory garden for what both knew would be their final shared visit. The vast cavern held new luminescence, flowers blooming in configurations that spoke of completion rather than beginning. Near the reflecting pool, Mira settled with the careful grace of someone whose bones had earned their rest through decades of necessary service. "You gave me the words," Kess said softly, "but you gave me more than that. You gave me the faith that gentleness could survive in a world built for hardness. And you gave those words wings," Mira replied, watching light dance across water that reflected not just their faces, but the faces of all who had learned to breathe together in trust. "You taught them to fly beyond these walls and take root wherever they were needed most." Her passing came as twilight inside daylight, an easing, a loosening, a long-held note resolving into rest. One steady exhale, and Mira became the quiet she had taught Kess to trust. The orchids brightened once, then settled, as if saying yes. Her funeral became Gazorpazorp's first celebration of a life lived in service to peace. Warriors arrived from across the districts, their faces wet with tears that flowed freely, unashamedly, nourishing the ground where her legacy would continue to bloom. Kes stood by the reflecting pool, holding a luminescent memory lily whose petals flickered with preserved moments. Mira discovering a tiny infant in a crater, teaching ancient words in whispered tones, sharing bread and quiet wisdom. When the gentle ceremony ended, Kes understood their inheritance not as burden, but as continuation. "Guardian," the garden seemed to whisper, and the word fit like a hand into a well-worn glove. The revolution was complete, not because it had ended, but because it had become so natural that no one remembered a time when warriors didn't know how to be gentle, when strength didn't include the courage to understand before striking. The inheritance settled around Kes like morning light, learning new ways to fall. And in the quiet days that followed Mira's peaceful transition, grief did not empty the sanctuary but clarified it, like rain settling dust until the path revealed its own shape. The heart-bloom orchids no longer pulsed with urgent messages, but held their luminescence steady, glowing with the deep contentment of promises kept and seeds planted in soil that had finally remembered how to nurture what it received. Kes rose before first light and sat beside the reflecting pool, learning the garden's new breath without Mira's soft footfalls to stitch it together. The silence felt different now, not hollow but full, carrying within it the accumulated weight of all the wisdom that had been shared in whispered tones. Moving row by gentle row, Kes began speaking each bloom's lineage into a small book bound in soft leather, preserving not just names, but the stories that had given them meaning. By the end of the first week, the outer door opened, not wide, just enough for those who needed the garden to find their way there. Tam arrived first, offering warmed water and bread wrapped in linen to visitors, who descended the spiral passage with questions growing in the spaces between heartbeats. Nira showed newcomers how to walk on the moss without bruising it, how to listen without grabbing at meaning. Jorik placed small cushions along the stone rim of the pool for knees, not yet used to the patience of kneeling. Warriors arrived from districts across half-Gazorpazorp, instructors who had heard whispers of flowers that held lullabies, veterans whose dreams had been touched by ancient melodies, children whose questions carried the weight of genuine seeking. Each visitor who knelt beside memory lilies or touched compassion roses carried their discoveries back to training halls and community centers, spreading understanding through the quiet authority of personal transformation rather than official mandate. Zara came wearing the modest insignia of pause between stars and helped establish simple rituals for those who wished to leave lighter than they came. At the garden center, a low bowl of smooth stones invited burdens. Each visitor could hold one, breathe a quiet truth into it, and set it among the others. Once a week under starlight, Kes and the remaining quiet guard carried the bowl to the cavern's depths, where the floor sloped toward deep earth, returning the stones with gratitude so nothing felt thrown away, only given a place to rest. Master Ralek visited alone after official hours, the way tired souls seek chapels when no one is looking. He stood before new blooms that had appeared near the pool, petals shaped like pause marks, and his shoulders lowered the way doors do when they are finally oiled. The transformations rippled outward through invisible networks, carried by visitors who returned to their districts with dream moss tucked into regulation pockets, with whispered words that made harsh commands gentler. As seasons turned, the garden ceased to be a secret and became a living classroom where Gazorpazorp's gentle future took root. The reflecting pool expanded its visions, showing glimpses of Peace Corps members mediating disputes through understanding rather than force, of training halls where the three questions had become natural as breathing, of communities discovering they could protect themselves through wisdom as well as weapons. Reports climbed through official channels, carrying statistics that spoke of unprecedented planetary harmony, border disputes resolved through negotiation, children growing up bilingual in both combat techniques and lullabies, monitoring devices registering heart rates that synchronized naturally during shared silence. The academy that had once trained warriors through controlled aggression became a place of pilgrimage, its corridors carrying the accumulated weight of transformation. In the memory garden's deepest chamber, new sections bloomed without being planted, vast galleries where Gazorpazorp's evolving peace could grow into whatever forms the future required. Kes spent quiet hours tending these living archives, understanding that guardianship meant ensuring the planet's hard-won wisdom would never again be forgotten. The revolution was no longer theirs to carry alone. It belonged to everyone who had learned that the gentlest changes are often the most lasting, that true warriors protect with understanding as well as weapons, that a world built for hardness could remember how to be tender without losing its strength. The years passed like patient water, finding its own course, and Gazorpazorp did not change all at once, but exhaled between days until even the wind forgot how to hurry. What had begun as whispered revolution in hidden alcoves settled into the planet's bones, with the quiet persistence of seasons learning new rhythms, transformation spreading through invisible networks until gentleness became as natural as breathing, strength as inclusive as starlight, touching every surface without preference. Kes moved through their role as guardian with the same unhurried grace they had brought to tending Mira's plants, understanding that some responsibilities grow lighter when carried with complete acceptance. The memory garden had expanded beyond its original chambers, new passages opening, as if the planet itself was making room for wisdom that could no longer be contained in secret spaces. Visitors arrived daily now, not as pilgrims seeking miracles, but as students learning practical skills for living gently in a world that still required strength. In coastal settlements, fishermen taught Veltar to their nets, pausing before each haul to ask the sea what it could spare. Their catches somehow more abundant when taken with gratitude rather than greed. Mining towns began each descent with the 3 questions, shift leaders listening for the soft place that might save a life hours later, accidents decreasing as understanding deepened between Earth and those who worked within it. At midday across all districts, someone offered half a sandwich folded in cloth, and shared bread became a quiet anthem stronger than any marching song. The academy itself had become something approaching legend, its walls now softened by dream moss that pulsed with gentle luminescence, training grounds where new paths had worn smooth from feet, practicing the 3 questions, until they no longer felt like questions, only the way hands meet without harm. Master Ralek had aged into a softness that made his authority easier to carry, teaching less by command and more by attention, placing his palm on a trainee's shoulder long enough for their heartbeats to find the same patient rhythm. Under Zara's leadership, the Peace Corps had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. Warriors trained not just in combat, but in the subtler arts of understanding opponents before engaging them, of creating space between heartbeats where resolution could take root. The doctrine of gentle warriors became planetary law not through force, but through recognition that it simply described what Gazorpazorp had already become. Children growing up bilingual in combat techniques and lullabies, their voices carrying melodies that had survived official forgetting. Beyond Gazorpazorp's sky, other worlds began to listen with curiosity rather than caution. Traders carrying ore and stories returned with accounts of patrols, resolving disputes through conversation, of border stations where music drifted at shift change, of a planet that trained warriors who could repair as well as repel. They toured the Academy's quiet halls, stood under banners pairing armor with vines, and left with small packets of dream moss sealed against the dry air of ships, carrying transformation in their regulation pockets, the planetary reputation that had once labeled Gazorpazorp, the planet of violence, had transformed into something more nuanced, the planet of balanced strength, where diplomatic missions sought mediation services and conflicts that had festered for generations found resolution through methods that honored both necessity and compassion. New towns bloomed where old battlefields had scarred the land, their architecture incorporating elements of both traditional strength and rediscovered gentleness, foundations built to withstand storms yet open to sky, embracing light and air. Inside the memory garden's newest chambers, Kes tended flowers that bloomed in configurations never seen before, petals shaped like joined hands, stems that pulsed with the rhythm of synchronized heartbeats, leaves that whispered harmonies in languages that hadn't existed until communities learned to sing together. The reflecting pool showed visions not just of individuals, but vast panoramas of a planet in harmony, children playing games of cooperation rather than competition, warriors standing guard with postures that expressed protection rather than aggression. The very language of Gazorpazorp had evolved, incorporating words resurrected from Mira's ancient scrolls, that became commonplace in daily conversation. Reports climbed through governance channels carrying ordinary statistics of a world remembering itself, fewer border disputes, quicker recovery after storms because neighbors didn't wait to be asked, monitors recording long stretches of steady breath where once only spikes of tension had registered. What had begun with a single raindrop carrying forgotten tenderness had become an ocean of possibility. The revolution complete not because it had ended, but because it had become so natural that no one remembered a time when strength and gentleness were considered opposites, when warriors didn't know how to create space between heartbeats, where wisdom could take root. In the garden's deepest chambers, new galleries displayed living threads connecting distant worlds where other forgotten gentleness waited to be remembered, and Gazorpazorp floated upon currents of change like a world finally at peace with its own vast, tender heart. The years passed like patient water finding its own course, and when leadership called to Zara, she did not seize power so much as she was invited to inhabit it, the way dawn is invited by horizon each morning. Her ascension ceremony unfolded without trumpets or marching formations. Instead, the entire planet observed a single hour of practiced quiet, workers in mines, cadets on training grounds, merchants in bright markets, or two, breathing together while temple bells rang softly across districts that had once known only war drums. Her first acts transformed governance, through gentle revolution rather than dramatic decree. The War Council became the circle of thresholds, its long table reshaped into a ring where no head presumed dominance over others. Each session began with the three questions that had once whispered in hidden alcoves. What hurts? What do you need? Where does it soften? And even stubborn strategists found themselves answering with unexpected honesty. Policies emerging that felt less like commands and more like bridges between understanding. Kess sat at her right during those early months, not as co-ruler but as anchor, speaking rarely and offering half a sandwich during long debates when tempers began to climb. The simple act disarmed performances that had never been nourishment, reminding everyone that decisions were fundamentally about human bodies needing sleep, food, and dignity. When Zara's words ran ahead of her meaning, the pace of governance tempting even the gentle to hurry, Kess would tilt a hand in quiet signal, and her voice would find the slower cadence that allowed wisdom to arrive on time. The first true test came when drought braided itself with unrest in the northern valleys, creating tensions that could have snapped back into old habits. Convoys carrying water met roadblocks of desperate hands while guild leaders demanded protection clauses that tasted of coercion. Zara traveled without ceremony, arriving at dusty junctions where arguments had hardened into stance. She listened 2 days before speaking, kept her boots on the same ground everyone else used, and asked the questions until answers uncoiled. The solution, when it came, was practical and almost plain. Rotating way stations staffed by guild apprentices and valley farmers together. Water carried in smaller portions more often. Schedules mapped to the breadth of land rather than hunger of markets. Under her guidance, the doctrine of gentle warriors became planetary law not through force, but through recognition that it simply described what Gazorpazorp had already become. Border settlements resolved disputes through conversation. Port authorities worked in harmonies that moved shipments faster than threats ever had. Guards whose calm voices unraveled panic before it needed containment. Other worlds sent observers wrapped in skepticism, witnessing a planet that governed through kindness without softening into foolishness. Through it all, Zara kept one ritual that no duty could steal, monthly descent into the memory garden where governance bowed to remembrance. There, with Kess beside the reflecting pool, she placed smooth stones in the low bowl and whispered the month's smallest truths, sometimes policies that worked, sometimes apologies that needed speaking. The garden received each confession without judgment, lilies flickering with understanding, orchids holding steady light. When they climbed back toward daylight, the planet felt more possible again. Leadership revealed as simply another practice in helping everything remember how to be whole. In distant chambers, galactic representatives began drafting invitations for the quiet world that had learned to govern through questions rather than commands, and Zara felt the temple bells of her dreams growing closer, calling toward whatever larger harmony was learning to breathe beyond their transformed sky. The years passed like patient water, finding its own course, And when the temple bells that had whispered in Zara's dreams finally rang with perfect clarity across all districts, the sound carried not triumph, but completion, the deep satisfaction of a world that had remembered its own heart. The crater where Kes had first been discovered now bloomed with gardens visible from orbit, spirals of luminescent flowers that pulsed with the rhythm of a planet breathing in harmony with itself. Kes moved through their guardianship with silver threading their hair, but posture unchanged, still carrying that unhurried grace that had once taught warriors to find space between heartbeats. The memory garden had expanded beyond imagination, new galleries opening as if the planet itself was making room for wisdom that could no longer be contained. Children from across Gazorpazorp visited not as tourists but as apprentices, learning to trace stories held within compassion rose petals while practicing combat forms that paused before landing, their voices weaving ancient lullabies with modern work songs. Old battlefields had transformed into meadows, threaded with streams, their soil enriched by the quiet tears of generations who had learned to grieve and heal together. Ancient craters became serene lakes, reflecting skies that held more stars than warnings, while border stations hummed with music at shift change, guards whose calm voices could unravel panic before it needed containment. In the garden's deepest chambers, Kes guided 3 apprentices who had grown ready in the way seasons are ready, not impatient, just faithful. Sarah hummed as she swept moss from stone pathways, even could hear the moment when troubled visitors found peace, and Raleigh's laughter made memory lilies open wider. The succession ritual unfolded with gentle ceremony, one hand on the old shield cradle where it all began, one hand on their own chest, one breath offered to water that reflected faces, then stars, then faces again. Zara's reign had lasted long enough to see transformation take root in soil too deep for any successor to uproot. Under her guidance, the doctrine of gentle warriors had become not just planetary law but the natural way things were done. Warriors from across the galaxy sought training at the academy, leaving with dream moss tucked in regulation pockets and hearts carrying echoes of temple bells that had finally found their way home. Diplomatic missions carried the 3 questions to conflict zones where species had forgotten how to listen, while Veltar was practiced in council chambers spanning the galaxy's breadth. That evening, as the first stars appeared over a world that no longer feared the dawn, Kes and Zara climbed to where the first gentle raindrop had fallen. The meadow whispered with small streams telling each other patient news, and they shared a final simple sandwich, split along the fault line of habit and devotion. "We didn't fix everything," Kes said, "because truth and tenderness prefer each other's company. We taught it to mend itself." When Kes descended the spiral passage one last time, they did not move so much as float, carried by accumulated gratitude. They placed Mira's travel cloak beside the shield cradle, smoothed wrinkles that no longer mattered, and sat until the lilies began to glow with that particular color that means rest is happening. The reflecting pool showed visions stretching beyond Gazorpazorp's sky, other worlds where forgotten gentleness waited to be remembered, carried by those who had learned that the softest things, properly tended, outlast declarations. Outside, the planet exhaled. Inside, Kes set one smooth stone in the bowl and whispered the smallest truth. "I am ready to be carried by what I carried." The pool reflected orchids, then only breath, and somewhere a lullaby crossed a courtyard and found a listening ear. And with that gentle revolution, Gazorpazorp learned to sleep peacefully under stars that no longer feared the dawn. The last gentle raindrop's gift, having become an eternal spring, nourishing whatever dreams the future chose to plant in soil, finally ready to receive them. And somewhere they're still out there napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.